Good evening, everyone. Hope you're doing well. Ed gave me the opportunity, but I would not care to toot my own horn. Not a big horn tooter. Not a big believer in introductions. Who cares where the guy went to school? Who cares where I went to school? Is the lesson going to be helpful or not? And that's all there is to it. You know, I've heard some introductions, probably my own included, where I thought, oh, that's pretty good. And then I hear the lesson and said, I was expecting more than that. So we'll just skip the introduction so that we don't set the bar unnecessarily high. But I believe today's the topic that I was assigned is probably the easiest that I've ever been assigned. Because my topic is, I believe that Sampson was a historical character. And the reason I believe that is because I believe the Bible. And I believe the Bible for all of the reasons that Neil said last week. And so that's why I believe in Sampson. And so that's really all there is to the lesson. It would be sad if we got together to study the Bible and that's all we did, but that's really as simple as it is. I tried to find out, are there people that don't believe in Sampson? They maybe believe in the Bible, but they question if Sampson was a real character. I couldn't find anyone that did that. I tried to find archaeological, historical evidence for Sampson outside of the Bible and can find almost none, very, very little. I reached out to a member of the church who is an archaeologist by trade and was not able to find out too much information about Sampson from a historical or archaeological perspective. Here is the totality of what I was able to find out that is outside of Scripture that might support the historical figure of Sampson. So one thing is that there was a seal, like a ring, like a signet that was found that had a man, and it was around the time period of Sampson, who was wrestling a lion. And so some people think that that may have even been Samson's signet ring that had him famously wrestling the lion. But most people don't claim that that was actually Samson's, just that it depicts a man from that time period of some sort wrestling a lion. Second, the biblical Philistine cities have been discovered. Now that's helpful. It doesn't mention Sampson at all, but we know that the Philistine cities are actual, real places. And things like that happen all the time. At the early 1900s, atheists used to say the Bible's ridiculous because there are no Hittites that have ever been found in recorded history anywhere. Well, not long after that, as you might imagine, there was some evidence found of Hittites, an overwhelming amount, so that now no one with any credibility questions if there were Hittites at all. But archaeology does what it always does eventually and supports the biblical account, and it does with the Philistines. And then finally, Samson's final act, the act where he pushes apart the two pillars and they fall in on the Philistine people, temples and tabernacles and idols to false gods have been found from that time period that show columns were about far enough apart that a man could reach both of them. And so it does not surprise us that what we find in archaeology is supported in the Bible even before we find it in archaeology. And then the last thing that I noticed is that we're all familiar with Hercules, right? Has anyone seen the Disney movie Hercules? Most people think that that Greek story of Hercules was based loosely on Sampson and the story of Sampson, and that Hercules is just a copy of the original, actual, real events that happened in the life of Sampson. Now, outside of that, I can't find anything other than the Bible that really talks about pro or con the life of Sampson. So we'll spend the rest of our time just looking at the biblical account. And if you want to turn to Judges chapter 13, there are only 4 chapters in the Bible that mention Sampson. Judges 13 briefly, then 14, 15, 16 are the story of his life, and then finally in Hebrews chapter 11. But as you turn to Judges chapter 13, and if you make notes in your Bible, this would be a good lesson to make notes in, just because we're going to stay in the same areas and we're going to make comments on his whole life, his whole story as we go. But as you're turning there, if you'll remember a little background about where we are, in case you're not familiar with this time period or this book or this person. But in Genesis chapter 12, God makes 3 promises to Abraham. And if you're ever looking in your Old Testament and you're confused about what's going on, God is fulfilling one of these 3 promises to Abraham. And so he tells Abraham, an older man with no kids, he says, I'm going to make a great nation come through you. So I know you're childless, but I'm God and there's no problem with that. I'm going to give you a great family. Not just one child, but a great family. Well, if you have a lot of people, what do you need for those people? You need a lot of land. And so God makes the land promise, promise number 2, and says, I'm going to give you a great land, the land of Canaan. And then finally, the most important promise, God says the Savior, the Messiah, the promised one, all the way back to Genesis chapter 3, where I started hinting at a solution for sin, that solution is going to come through your family line. And so the whole rest of the Old Testament it's really about God and Jesus coming and all these things, but it's about the fulfilling of these three promises. So it takes about 25 years before Abraham has that first kid, before he has the child of promise, Isaac. And then it takes about 430 years before they are a great nation who is given that land. And then it takes about 2,000 years till Jesus comes. So everything God does is very methodical, very intentional, very slow. God is never caught off guard and says, oh no, what will I do? And comes up with a new plan. But God is very slow and methodical. And when we think about why didn't God just give the land to Abraham immediately, I love what the Bible says. God says, I can't give it to you yet because the iniquity of the people that live there right now is not full. I'm going to give them time to make things right. And when the time comes that they say, I don't care what God says, and there are people that are beyond redemption, at that time I will punish them and I'll take the land, but not until then. And so God gives them that 430-year period. And I'm so thankful that God is gracious and patient and slow. Because it's easy to look back and say, man, what a bunch of messed up people with problems. But we think about ourselves, we think about the problems we've had, the mistakes that we've made, and we're thankful for a slow and patient God as well. But because of that, as they leave Egypt, as they're taken out from slavery by God, even in their unthankfulness, even in their ungratefulness, God does that, and He takes them and He gives them the promised land, the land of Canaan. And you know that Moses was going to take them into that land. He was going to be able to be in that land and see it, but he started taking too much credit for what God was doing. And he started saying things like, me and God, we will do this for you. We did this. And he starts a pattern of disobeying God. And because of those different things, God says, look, you're going to be punished. You'll be able to see the promised land, but you won't be able to enter it. And from that, Joshua, one of those 12 faithful spies, takes them in to the promised land and divides it up. And now the second of God's promises to Abraham is fulfilled. And when they get there, God says, the people here, I have been patient with them enough. And in my divine wisdom, kick them out, drive them out. If you have to kill them, if you have to take them and make them move somewhere else, to do that, because that's part of their punishment. I've given them 430 years to change, and they have not. Now it's time to punish them. Well, the Israelites did that perfectly, and everything was in peace and harmony from there on out. No, of course not. We know that's not what happened. They drove some of the people out, but some of them, they didn't. And because of that, these people would always be a thorn in the side of God's people. And so it is that Joshua takes them, gives them the promised land, but doesn't completely drive everyone out. And after that happens, the Israelites are going to sink into a cycle, and it's going to happen over and over and over again. They are going to sin before God. God is going to either punish them or allow them to be punished. Then in the midst of that punishment, they cry out to God, please save us. And God listens. He delivers them, rises up a judge to deliver them, either a spiritual leader, a battle leader, a government leader, one of those kinds of leaders, and drives them out, brings them back, saves them, delivers them, and they enjoy a time of peace. And then what do they do from that time of peace? They sink back into sin. They're punished, or God allows them to be punished. They cry out, God, please save us. God does, and they live in a time of peace, and over and over and over the cycle goes. And it's in the midst of that cycle that we find this judge, Sampson, and we see him. So look at chapter 13, and let's read what that chapter briefly mentions about Sampson. Look at verse 5. And it says in verse 5, I think verses 4 and 5, but verse 5 especially, it says that this man, Sampson, will be a Nazirite. Now, there's not a lot of information in the Bible about a Nazirite, but if you wanted to make a reference in your Bible beside Judges chapter 13 and verse 5, you could put Numbers 6, 1 through 8, and 13. Numbers 6, 1 through 8, and 13. I'm going to read part of that to you right now. So this is Numbers chapter 6, talking about what the Nazirite vow is, starting in verse 1. And the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, speak to the people of Israel and say to them, when a man or a woman makes a special vow, the vow of a Nazirite, to separate himself to the Lord, here are the things that he will do. Verse 3, he'll separate himself from wine and strong drink. Not only that, he'll drink no vinegar made from wine or strong drink, and won't have any drink of any juice of grapes, or eat grapes, fresh or dried. All the days of his separation, he'll not eat anything that is produced by the grapevine, not even the seeds or the skins. Then number 2, verse 5, all the days of his vow of separation, no razor shall touch his head, until the time is completed for which he separates himself to the Lord. He shall be holy. The locks of his hair, of his head, grow long. And then finally, verse 6, all the days that he separates himself to the Lord, he'll not go near a dead body. Not even for his father or his mother, for brother or sister. If they die, he shall make himself unclean, because his separation to God is on his head. All the days of his separation he is holy to the Lord. And then verse 13, this is the law of the Nazirite when the time of separation has completed. So a few things to notice. First of all, the Nazirite vow, as is set forth in the book of Numbers, is for a period of time. Now, Samson's vow is different for two reasons. One, he does not choose it. It is given to him even in the womb. And then number two, typically, as we see in Numbers, it's for a period of time. I'm going to be a Nazirite for a year, for 6 years, for 10 years, for 20 years, whatever the case may be. But it's not an indefinite life sentence when you take the vow. It's voluntary for a period of time. And there are a lot of things like that in the Bible. Fasting is that way, right? Maybe you fast as one of your spiritual disciplines, but you're not to go around shouting that and letting everybody know, nor are you to do it forever. We're told there are some conflicts between a husband and wife where fasting from a sexual relationship is a good idea, but only when agreed upon and only for a certain period of time. So the Bible is full of this idea. And then second of all, it's something that you choose, but this is different with Samson because it was given to him. So in chapter 14 of Judges, we learn about Samson. Now, as we get into his life story, chapter 14, 15, and 16, we're thinking about a great leader of God. I mean, a strong man. Even if you don't know the Bible, you know about the strength of Samson, the physical strength that he had. And we know he's going to be a leader from God. He's going to be a special guy. He's a Nazirite. God has ordained him, picked him, set him apart, put these additional rules on him to keep him pure and separate and holy. So when we find out about his life in chapters 14, 15, and 16, it's not what we would expect from a leader appointed by God. So let's go through his story. Look at chapter 14. Look at verses 1 through 4. We won't read each of these verses, but we'll just try to summarize them and make a few points as best we can. But in verses 1 through 4, Samson decides to take a wife from the Philistines. Now his parents get upset with him. We might be the same way. We raise our kids and we want them to marry someone that's in the faith. We want them to do that so that their house is a place of peace and mutual growth and not a place of conflict. I know when I do Bible time with my girls each night, and even if we don't do anything else, we'll have a prayer. And one thing I pray every night is that the girls will grow up to be Christians, and if they choose to get married, that they'll marry a Christian. And that if they want kids, God will bless them with that. And I want them to hear that from me over and over and over and over and over. And I know you've thought and felt some of those same things before. So Samson's parents naturally get upset with him because he is marrying a heathen. Now they think he is choosing based on outward appearances, and I always had too until I read the story closer. But little do they know that it's part of his plan to get close to the Philistines. And not only that, it's an idea that was given to him by God. At the time that the Philistines ruled over Israel, isn't that something? I mean, God had said, here's the promised land. I've helped take them out. Now I want you to go in. I want you to finalize it. Obey me. Drive them out, and the land will be yours with peace. And they do everything but that. Now the people they should be ruling over, by the time we get to Judges 14, they're ruling over the Israelites. So it's really sad to see that. But Samson and God had other plans. So the Philistines had always been a thorn in the side of the people of Israel, and now God and Samson worked to be a thorn in their side through this marriage. Then verses 5 through 6. Samson and his parents walked to a city called Timnah, and this is the city where this Philistine girl lives. Now apparently, as they walked, at some point they separated. Parents, have you ever gone on a walk with your kids? Do they ever get ahead of you so far? Maybe you can't even see them, or they lag behind. I have one kid that's always going to finish everything first, and I have one that's always going to be a mile behind, like begging us to wait. So very different, even though they're twins at the age of 6. But I'm sure that's what happened here. Whatever happened, Samson and his parents separated. And it was at that time of separation that a lion sprung out in order to attack Samson. Now look at verse 6. It says, the Spirit of the Lord rushed on Samson. Now as you read through all the different judges, there's going to be a lot of times where the Spirit of the Lord comes on them. Now, I had always felt like once God is with you, He is just with you indefinitely. His mind is in your mind. His words are on your lips. And you have it easier to an extent because God is helping you. But that's really not the picture that Scripture portrays. Even inspired men in the New Testament, when they appointed elders, do you remember they did it by fasting and by prayer? That's why Paul sometimes would say, well, this is what I want to do, but I do the opposite. I want to do this, but God isn't letting me. And so even with the judges, we see periods where God helps them, inspires them, that kind of thing. But then, for the most part, they're on their own, other than the wisdom, the words of God that He's spoken to them. Most of the judges, when the Spirit of the Lord comes on them, it's so that they can make a wise decision. It's so that they can lead the people, speak a message that God has given them. But every time we see it with Samson, it's different. Each time we see Samson filled with the Spirit of the Lord, it's for fighting or for battle. And so that's kind of a unique thing that Samson has. And so when it happens, it shows that it's with God's given authority that he does this whatever physical feat that it is. Now it says here, when he fought the lion, he tore it like a young goat. Now that's interesting to me. Has anybody ever torn a young goat into pieces? That still sounds kind of hard. When I grew up on a lot of land, and some years we had a huge farm, and one year we got chickens, and we had chickens for a while. And has anybody ever killed chickens on your own? Okay, so you know when you kill the chickens, you have to wring the neck, and then you put it down and you'll chop the head off. And then it's wild to see, especially as a kid, but the chicken continues to move as if it were alive. And you think, I thought we killed it. We'll try again, zombie chicken. But even the wringing of the neck of the chicken, which is a much smaller animal, to me was kind of difficult. And so I don't know if it's that Samson, or maybe a young goat, has a similarity to a chicken and it's easy to wring the neck of. Or I don't know if it's maybe just saying that something powerful like a lion was like something with no strength, something small, to a man that was as strong and especially blessed from God as Samson. Now, there have been other times when men of the Bible have had interaction with lions. You remember that David, before he killed the Philistine Goliath, you remember what helped him get his confidence to be able to think that he could do that? He remembered back to his days as a shepherd, and he said, well, I killed this animal, and among them was the lions. And so when he hears the Philistine making fun of God, he doesn't automatically go to, well, I'm so strong I could take this guy, because he knows the power's not in him. But he says, God can kill this guy. How has no one stood up with the power of God's help and taken this guy down? And they laugh at him because he's younger than most and he can't even wear the armor. But he says, well, hold on, before you laugh, I've killed a bear and I've killed a lion. And it was God that helped me do that, and God will help me kill this heathen as well. And so he uses that fact that he had killed a lion to have the confidence to be able to fight the Philistine. So before David, Samson killed a lion and learned that the uncircumcised Philistines would be like the dead lion before him. Just like David would do years later, Samson did it even before David. So Samson, before his fight with the Philistines that's coming in the following chapters, kills a lion by the power of God. And at the end of the verse, it says, Samson didn't tell his parents what he had done. Now, you're probably better than I am, but there were a lot of things I did as a kid and a teenager where I didn't always tell my parents. Some of those were okay, harmless little things, and some I was just being a knucklehead, and I should have known better than that. You're probably better than me in that regard. Why didn't Samson tell his parents about what he had done? Was he like most of us at a certain age where you just do things you don't always tell your parents? Was this Samson showing some humility, some modesty? Yeah, I did it, but there's no need to brag about it. It was God that did it through me. You know, we don't really know. We don't know which one of those it might have been. So they go to see his wife. Now, Samson had just killed an animal and touched it, right? Remember what we read in Numbers, that you weren't supposed to touch a dead body? Had he broken his Nazirite vow? Well, another thing about the Nazirite vow is it only applied to human bodies. So the fact that he killed an animal didn't make him unclean. Additionally, some scholars say that since Samson did not take the Nazirite vow himself, he didn't choose to do it, it wasn't a voluntary thing, but it was placed on him, then only the things that the angels said to his parents were the things that applied to him, which would have been nothing from the grape and not cutting your hair. But the angel, when the angel pronounced the Nazirite vow onto Samson, mentioned nothing about dead bodies. So that's just an interesting fact to consider. But look at verses 8 through 9. Now they're making their trip back from their home to see Samson's wife to be again. Now it's probably been about a year between these few short verses, because that's how long the traditional engagement period lasted. Samson is again by himself, and I'm imagining he may have forgotten at times in his life about what happened to the lion, though probably never completely. But as he's walking by, it's like he remembers, oh, I need to check and see what happened to that lion carcass. And so he turns into the vineyard to see the body of the lion. And what he finds is that bees have taken up residence in the carcass of the dead lion. Now Canaan, we know, is a land of what? Milk and honey. Well, here's some of the honey. Now, there are other mentions of this happening in ancient literature, that is, bees taking up residence in a carcass. So it may not have been an everyday thing, I'm sure it wasn't, but it did happen from time to time. And so he eats the honey, he shares it with his parents, though again, he doesn't tell them where it came from. And then verse 10, it gets interesting, with regard especially to their culture and marriage rituals. So in verse 10, this marriage ritual between he and his wife-to-be starts. And Sampson prepares a feast. And I love that it shows a young man being the one that gets the feast and prepares it. I love that a mom and or a dad, a grandmother and or a granddad, typically do those kinds of things for the family. But it's nice to see a kid here being a part of their ritual, or a young man at least, and providing for the family. One of the qualifications for elders is that they are given to hospitality. And it's not the elders' wives, but it's the elders. Typically when we think about hospitality, it's a feminine trait. I'll clean the house, I'll open up, and I'll prepare a meal. And that's great. That's a Christian thing to do. But when we think about elders, they themselves need to be people that are given to hospitality. That means they plan the event. They may do some cleaning. They may at least oversee it. They may be part of it. But whatever, that needs to be one of the traits of our elders in the church, is given to hospitality. And it's here. It's nice to see it in a young man. Now verse 30, 30 men come from his future family, his wife's future family, or his wife's family, his future family, or at least her community. And that's kind of an interesting thing. Why do 30 men come to the party before the wife comes? Well, they come as soon as they see Sampson. So it may be that they see Sampson and are intimidated by him. And so I kind of see them talking about, well, who's going to go talk to this guy and make sure he's okay? I'm not going. Did you see that guy? Well, come on, you go with me. I'm not going with you. Okay, well, what if we just all go? And all 30 men go to see Sampson. I imagine he was a physical specimen to behold. And maybe they felt like they needed 30. But it was also common for a group of men to come to a wedding before the festivities began. They would come before the woman to make sure that it was safe, to make sure that things were decent and in order, and that everything was respectful, and it was a safe environment for her to come into. But it was also to protect her. When that group of men came, their culture tells us that they were saying, look, we're going before you. And if we get there and this man is not fit to be your husband, or if he backs out of it, we as a group and as a community will take care of you and support you. And that's a beautiful precedent. We do that with our widowers, I hope, our widows. And we say, hey, look, if you've got no family, you've got nobody that can take care of you, we will do that. You're not going to go untaken care of. You're not going to go unloved or unchecked on in this community. And so it was with their community as well. But then look at verses 12 through 14. It says there together the feast is going to last about 7 days. You ever hung out with strangers for 7 days? Sometimes that can be fun, I guess. But if you have nothing in common, hey, what's your favorite food, your favorite color, where you're from, runs out pretty quick. And so I imagine that you might get bored occasionally. So Sampson gives them a riddle, maybe just to pass the time, maybe for fun, or maybe just to see how smart they are. And so he says, if you can solve this riddle, I'll give you 30 garments of clothes. But if you can't, you have to give it to me. And this would have been special clothes that they used for special occasions. It would have been like probably our 3-piece suit and a nice undershirt, dress shirt to go with it. So he gives them the riddle, and he says, out of the eater came something to eat, and out of the strong came something sweet. And so after 3 days of working on this riddle, they still can't solve it. I guess they haven't killed a lion, and I guess they haven't eaten honey out of its carcass either. So verse 15, they get Samson's bride involved, and they threaten her. They said, did you invite us here to get robbed? Tell us the answer to this riddle, or we're going to burn your father's house down with you in it. That seems pretty dramatic, doesn't it? Verses 16 and 17, so Samson's wife, she takes the threat seriously and she troubles him. And we understand that. I feel bad for her. She thinks she'll die if she doesn't. And she's having to choose early on where her allegiance is going to be. So she says to Samson, oh, Samson, you won't open up to me. You won't share your secrets with me. You don't really love me. You hate me. I haven't even told my parents, Samson replies to her and says, and now you want me to tell you, but he won't do it. He won't give in and he won't answer, but she keeps asking and she keeps crying, and I imagine she looks beautiful, and she plays on his tender heart, and she keeps asking. And so on the 7th day of the feast, the last day, he tells her. Now, how do you think Samson told her? Do you think he said, honey, you're right. I'm sorry I'm holding this from you. I love you so much. Let me open up to you and share my innermost thoughts and secrets. Or do you think he was frustrated? I imagine he probably said something like, will you shut up? Fine. I'll tell you. Just anything. Just shut up and leave me alone. But what does she do? She tells his secret, the answer, to her people. And look at verse 18. The men of the city, the 30 companions, they go to Samson at the end of the 7th day and tell him the answer to his riddle. Now, they don't just say, hey, it was a lion carcass with honey in it. But instead, they answer his riddle with a riddle. Look at what they say. They answer and they say, well, what's sweeter than honey? And what's stronger than a lion? So they answer his riddle with a riddle. But notice this. They may have been giving a riddle back to him. Instead of just answering his riddle, they answer it in the form of a question. What's sweeter than honey? What's stronger than a lion? Well, for Samson, what was sweeter than honey? What was stronger than a lion? The influence of a woman. The enticement of a woman. Now look at his reply to their question. He says to them, if you had not plowed with my heifer, you would not have found out my riddle. Isn't that beautiful, guys? Valentine's Day. It's never too early to get started. You want to make your own card? Put this in there and call your wife a heifer. See how that goes for you. That's what Samson did. If you had not plowed with my heifer. Very creative. Very good, Samson. So maybe he's saying, hey, speaking of my woman, as you've answered the riddle, and you've put forth a riddle to me, what's sweeter than honey to me, what's stronger than a lion to me, speaking of my woman, if you hadn't messed with her, you wouldn't have found out. So verses 19 through 20, again, we see the Spirit of the Lord rush upon him. And remember, this isn't an act of vengeance. It may be on Samson's part, but not in God's calculated efforts. Remember, God is using this union, this marriage, to drive a wedge between the Philistines, to separate them from his chosen people and to further punish them. So verses 19 through 20, the Spirit of the Lord rushed upon him, and he went down to a town about 25 miles away, killed 30 of the men of the town, took their clothes as spoil, so that he could pay the men who figured out the riddle. And in anger at what had happened, he left the marriage ceremony, left his bride-to-be all alone, and went back to his father's house. And it was assumed by everyone that was a part of the festivities that he would never be back, that he had given up on the marriage. And so Samson's wife was actually given to his companion, who was set to be his best man. So in Judges 14, when Samson's betrayed by his wife-to-be in the Philistines, the Bible says in hot anger, he went back to his father's house. You think about the story of the prodigal son. You remember that in Luke chapter 15, when the guy says, hey, Dad, I wish you were dead. Just go ahead and give me my money so I can live it up and have what's rightfully mine. And the dad says, okay, I'll do that. And he gives him his portion of the inheritance, and the guy goes off, and things are going great because he's got a lot of money, which means he's got a lot of friends and he's having a good time. But unfortunately for him, he chose the wrong kind of friends, because when the money ran out, the friends were gone too. And he wakes up one day in a pig pen, which would have been an insult to his Jewishness to be around pigs, doing the work below servants, and says, man, if I was at home, it would not be like this. And so he thinks, well, I got to come up with a speech or reason that my dad will even accept me. And so he rehearses it over and over, and he says, you know what I'll do? I won't go back and say, can I be a son? Can I live with you again? I'll just say, can I be a servant? Well, you just put me to work. I will work for you. Forget the sonship. I just want to be a servant to you. And he rehearses it. Don't you think on the trip home he's going over and over it again in his head? Okay, I'll lead with this. I'll say this. And if he acts like this, then maybe I'll say this. But he doesn't have a chance to give the speech, because as he gets home, his dad is looking down the driveway as if he were saying, man, I hope my son comes home today. I hope he comes home right now. And the beautiful thing about that is that's exactly how God does with us. The world would say, you've sinned, you've messed up, you're a loser, nobody would understand, you better just give up. And that shame can drive a wedge between us and God. But in reality, God is there saying, I know what you are going through. I created you. I know you better than you know yourself. Jesus came in the flesh, was tempted in every way like man is. I know what it is to fall. Please come home. It's okay. I love you. And so we relate to God in that way. And we love God. And we know that even when we mess up, God is not vindictive. He's not hateful. Like, I'll give you salvation again this time, but it better be the last time. But God is so loving and caring, and His arms and His door is always wide open. So I think it's interesting that Samson, when he runs into problems, he says, I want to go home to my dad. I think it's interesting when the prodigal son runs into problems, he says, hey, I want to go home to my dad. And I hope our homes will always be a place that if our kids get in trouble, no matter how much trouble they get in, no matter how heartbroken they are, no matter what goes wrong, that their first reaction is to say, man, I want to go home because it's better at home. And it can always be that way spiritually, even if it can't be that way in our families. And that's the beauty of God's spiritual family. Then look at chapter 15. Look at verses 1 through 2. So Samson cools down after a period of time. He goes back to get his wife. And he takes a goat as a gift, as a peace offering. But when he gets there, he talks to the father, and he finds out that she's already been given in marriage. And the father says in verse 2, and I feel the pain of his words, Samson, I'm sorry, I really thought you had utterly hated her. You had abandoned her. You were never coming back. And so she needed to be married. I gave her to your companion. And he even says, hey, her younger sister is even more beautiful. She's even fairer. Will that work? Can we work something out? Look at verses 3 through 8. So this makes Samson angry, and he decides to avenge himself. So he takes 300 foxes, and he ties them together in pairs. Now the word for several biblical words can mean different things, so it can be hard to pin down exactly what's meant. This word that means foxes can also mean jackals. Now, foxes typically hunt alone, whereas jackals hunt in packs. And so if it were jackals, it would have been easier to get them all at one time, easier and quicker to trap them. But this word can also mean handfuls. So Samson either went through and found all these foxes and tied them together, set their tails on fire and let them run through the cornfields, or he found a pack of jackals, took them, did that, or he got a handful of something, maybe even the corn, tied it together, lit it on fire, and threw it into the cornfields as he walked through them. But whichever one of those that it is, and we can't know for sure, he put to fire the fields of the Philistines. Now it's neat that history tells us that some of these crops would have been used in worship to their false god, Dagon. And so they had set these crops apart to be used for their false god, part of them for sure. And it's as if Samson goes through the field and he sacrifices it to the true God as he goes instead. So when the Philistines find out that it's Samson that did this, they burn Samson's ex and his former father-in-law to death. Now, the Philistines had threatened Samson's wife. You'll remember when the marriage festivities were going on and they couldn't figure out the riddle, that if she couldn't get the riddle from Samson, they would burn her and her father's house. So to save herself, she obliged, and she betrayed her husband, who could have protected her all along, betrayed God even in that process to an extent, and she obliged her countrymen and betrayed her husband. And what happened when she did that? The very thing that she hoped wouldn't happen. The very thing she was trying to avoid by sinning against her husband happened to her. And it was the countrymen that she was trying to please that did this to her. You know, sometimes we are tempted to sin to avoid a problem. I read a Bernstein Bears book to my kids the other day, and they break the lamp, and Mama Bear comes in and says, who broke the lamp? She knew who broke the lamp. She knew how the lamp was broken. Gives them an opportunity, and they say, it's crazy, a bird flew in the window, and they have all these crazy stories. And at the end of the story, they decide, you know, obviously it's the end of a kid's story. It's going to have a happy ending. But they decide, we want to tell the truth, and so they tell the truth, and Mama Bear says, I'm much more interested in if you tell the truth than what it is you're trying to cover up. And so a lot of times we have the same temptation. You know, I messed up on my taxes, and I can cover that up, and nobody will probably ever know. Or I could do this thing that's, well, it's a little bit of a gray area if you want to be, you want to know the truth about it, but I'll probably never get caught. Or, man, I did something I shouldn't have, but if I'll just tell a lie, nobody will ever know that it was me. If I don't own up to it, nobody will ever know. And so we're tempted to sin in order to avoid some problem, whatever it may be. But the problem with that is the same problem that Samson's wife found is when you sin to avoid a problem, you don't ever avoid the problem. You just make it worse. And so it was with Samson's wife in this situation. She thought, well, I'll do this that I shouldn't do to stay out of trouble. But the sin always causes more trouble in the long run. And so this further angers Samson, and he kills the men that did this. Look at verses 9 through 13. So in revenge, I mean, this is just like Hatfields and McCoys, right? They're going to go back and forth, back and forth. Verses 9 through 13, in revenge, the Philistines encamp against a city in Judah to attack it. And Judah basically asks, hey, why are you guys getting ready to fight against us? Why are we going to war? What's going on here? Why do you want to attack us? And the Philistines say, we've come to get Samson. If you will bind him up and turn him over to us, then we won't fight you. we're going to do to him what he did to us. So 3,000 men, so in the Philistines, 30 men went to talk to Samson. Now 3,000 of his own men. I mean, that's the same that were converted on the day of Pentecost. 3,000. They go to find Samson to ask him to turn himself over to the Philistines. And it's kind of sad. They were willing to sacrifice Samson to the Philistines to avoid war with them. I mean, Samson's whole deal, everything about Samson, whether it's good or bad, is he was trying to fight for the people of Israel. I mean, he was trying to drive out the enemy. How pathetic for them to mistreat the man that was trying to fight them. You know, is there a lesson in that for us? You know, sometimes some of our worst wounds come from each other. Isn't that true? I mean, if I have been at school, or I work with Christians, so this isn't a reflection on them, but at work, anywhere you might be where there are non-Christians, it is no surprise when non-Christians act like non-Christians, right? That doesn't surprise us that the world acts like the world. It always has, it always will. But what really hurts is when someone that's a Christian treats us in an un-Christ-like way. You know, I would expect the non-Christians to act that way, but not Christians. You know, when our brethren misunderstand us, when they attack us, when they make fun of us, they try to take advantage of us, that's what really hurts. So the lesson in that for us is, don't tear down the team we're both playing on. I mean, there's really only two teams in this world, God's team and the devil's team, or the world's team. And if you are attacking someone that's a part of God's team, you're attacking the team that we're both playing on and living for and fighting for. Don't attack the men and women who are fighting for you. Think about who are Farley's greatest leaders, or who are the greatest leaders in the church in this city, in this county, in this state. Raise their arms. Don't raise arms against them. Defend them. Encourage them. That's the best thing we can do for each other. Are we perfect? No, absolutely not. But we need to encourage each other. The world will tear us down enough. So Samson promises to turn himself into the Philistines if his fellow Israelites will not harm him. So, look, if you guys won't kill me, I'll turn myself in, if that'll save you guys from having to go to war. So he agrees, and they take him tied up to the Philistines. But Samson knew how and when to fight, and he also knew when to submit. And I think there's a good lesson in that for us. Know when to fight and know when to submit. Verses 14 through 15 say, the Philistines came shouting to meet him. Have you ever seen somebody get a little too big for their britches? You ever see a little kid try to pick a fight with somebody? It'd be like if Dale tried to pick a fight with me. You know what I mean? Have you ever seen a little dog barking at a bigger dog, thinking that they can take it? The Philistines came shouting. They thought they had him. They could taste the sweet revenge. And then it says, then the Spirit of the Lord rushed upon him. And you know what's about to happen when that happens with Samson. And the ropes that were on his arms became as flax that had been caught in the fire, and the bonds melted off his hands. And he found a fresh jawbone of a donkey, put out his hand and took it, and with it he struck 1,000 men. You know, don't start fights that you can't finish, is what these men learned. The real power, though, the key for us is, it wasn't with Samson. There's never been a man alive strong enough to defeat 1,000 people if God wasn't with him. The real power was with God, and God will not be mocked. He will not be shouted down. He won't be defeated. And here God defends his people through the strength of Samson. Verses 18 through 19, Samson is thirsting almost to death. Can you imagine? You've just killed 1,000 people with the power of God. And the first thing the Bible says happens to you after that is you're so thirsty, you're about to die. Now, I wonder why that is. I mean, obviously, doing anything for a very long period of time is going to make you tired, going to make you thirsty, especially physical fighting like that. But I think there's more to it. I think the point is that Samson's strength was in the thirsting for water, whereas God's strength was in the killing of 1,000 men. You know, through Samson's power, where had that left him? Needing water. God's strength is made perfect in our weakness. The victory belonged to God and to his power, not to Samson and his. And then verse 20, he judged Israel in the days of the Philistines 20 years. So Israel wouldn't stand up for Samson. They wouldn't fight with him. They wouldn't bring him food and drink after his victory. But now they can't help but follow his God-given leadership. All right, then our last chapter, chapter 16. Verse 1 says that Samson was a man that was driven by passions. You know, I hope we're driven by passions, but it's up to us to decide if we're driven by good passions or bad. And so sometimes Samson followed good ones, sometimes he followed bad ones, but here he goes into a Philistine prostitute. And what a shame that is. Verses 2 through 3, the Philistines hear that Samson is in their city, and they surround the house where he is to ambush him and kill him. But before they can, Samson gets up, tears off the gate of the doors of the city, the 2 posts that were hanging on them, and carries them outside the walls to the top of a hill. I imagine it's like he ripped out the front of this church building and carried it and walked it up a hill and sat so everyone could see him and put it down, saying, "Here I am, come and get me. Here's what I can do to this, and here's what I'll do to you." Ed, what time do we usually stop? Oh, man. We're going to sing some. I don't have enough for that. I'm just kidding. Got maybe 5 more minutes. Is that okay? Okay, great. All right, so verse 4, Samson falls in love with another woman. Now, you know the name of this woman. Who is this? Delilah, that's right. Now, it's interesting to me to think that the strongest man in the Bible, Samson, the wisest man in the Bible other than Jesus, Solomon, and then a man after God's own heart, meaning a man that God looked at among the people and said, I want him to lead, David, all had the same downfall, the opposite sex. So that's just interesting to me to notice. But verse 5, the leaders of the Philistines ask Delilah to seduce Samson to find out where his strength lies and how to defeat him. You know, I think about the world. We are to be in the world but not of the world, and sometimes we say to ourselves, I'm going to go here so I can have an influence over the people, which is a good thing, and we can't have an influence over people if we don't know them. If we don't know any non-Christians, we won't convert any. But at the same time, we have to be careful to spend so much time with them that we become like them. And I think that's what happened with Samson. He had good intentions, godly plans to infiltrate the Philistines, to separate them from God's people and to rule over them. But he eventually let his passions drive him in a negative way. So verses 6 through 14, Delilah is going to ask Samson over and over to reveal the source of his strength. And they go back and forth, and he tells her a lie. She shares it with the Philistines. They come in and do it. He springs up, kicks them out. They bust in. They try to take Samson again and again. It doesn't work, and they leave. And they do this 3 times. Well, finally, just like with the first woman in the story with Samson, Delilah eventually wears Samson down. She knows the way to his heart. She knows the weakness of this strong man. And she says, how can you say, I love me, when your heart isn't with me? You've mocked me these 3 times. You've told me, you have not told me where your great strength lies. And look at verses 16 through 20. She pressed him hard with her words day after day and urged him, and his soul was vexed to death. And he told her all his heart and said to her, a razor has never come upon my head, for I've been a Nazirite to God from my mother's womb. I want to take just a time out here. This isn't really the point of this verse, but I want to think about something. Samson was a Nazirite when? From birth? No. From his decision? No. From his mother's womb. When we talk about protecting life, we talk about protecting the unborn. I think this would be a good verse to mention, or at least to think about for ourselves, to be convinced that life starts at conception, not at birth. God ordained, God divinely called Samson to be a Nazirite even as he was in his mother's womb. And so we always want to stand up for the unborn or for any of those that can't help themselves and celebrate and stand up for the sanctity of life. But he says, if my head is shaved, then my strength will leave me. I'll become weak and be like any other man. And when Delilah saw that he had told her all his heart, she told the Philistines. They came in, ran in, did what the weakness had been exposed, and he had said to her. And she said, the Philistines are upon you, Samson, verse 20. And he awoke from his sleep and said, I'll go out as at other times and shake myself free. So sad. He thought, oh, this will be like any other time. I've never had a problem with strength before. The strength is in my hair. Well, really, the strength is in me, so I should be fine. But he didn't know that the Lord had left him. You know, what a sad story. How sad when the Lord leaves us. Verses 21 through 22, the Philistines seized him, gouged out his eyes, brought him down to Gaza, and bound him with shackles. He ground at the mill in the prison, but the hair of his head began to grow again after it had been shaved. Verses 23 and 24, the Philistines gather to worship their false god Dagon. Samson is captured. He's brought in. He's ridiculed. He's mocked. He's made a part of their festivities. His sin, his weakness, has given an occasion for God to be mocked. I mean, how many times have we seen that? Someone falls in a very public way, and it gives non-Christians an opportunity to mock our faith and to mock God. And so we have to be careful about allowing sin into our life. Verse 24, and when the people saw him, they praised their God, for they said, our God has given our enemy into our hand, the ravager of our country, who has killed many of us. Then in verses 25 through 21, verse 25, and when their hearts were merry, they said, call Samson that he may entertain us. And so they called him out of the prison, and he entertained them, and they made him stand between the pillars. And remember, as we said, archaeology has proven the pillars of this time and this part of the world were designed in such a way that they were close enough for a man to be able to touch both of them at the same time. And so he says, let me fill the pillars on which the house rests, that I may lean against them. I may rest. Now the house was full of men and women. All the lords of the Philistines were there. And on the roof there were about 3,000 men and women who looked on while Sampson entertained. And then Sampson called to the Lord and said, O Lord God, please remember me. Please strengthen me only this once, that I may be avenged on the Philistines for my 2 eyes. And then he grasped the middle 2 pillars on which the house rested. He leaned his weight against them, his right hand on one, his left on the other. And Sampson said, let me die with the Philistines. Then he bowed all his strength, and the house fell upon the lords, upon all the people who were in it. And so the dead whom he killed at his death were more than those he had killed in his life. An amazing moment. Then his brothers and all his family came and took him and brought him up and buried him. And then the end of the verse says he had judged Israel for 20 years. So I want to make just a few conclusions and then we'll be done. Sometimes our strengths can become our weaknesses. A strength, even if it's God-given, if we lean on it too much, the gift instead of the gift giver, it can become a weakness. Even our victories, if they produce a sense of self-reliance, an inflated sense of worth, can become our failures. The desires that we have alter our directions. What do you want to be when you grow up? What kind of person do you want to marry? What kind of work do you want to do for the Lord's church? What's most important in your life? Well, you answer those questions and you'll see the direction that your life is going to go, because our desires can alter our direction. And then our feeling of security can leave us vulnerable. Sometimes like the little dog who barks at a bigger dog, sometimes like a little kid who might pick a fight with someone bigger than them. Our feeling of security, like Samson's, can leave us vulnerable. Now, I want to end on a couple verses with you, and the lesson will be yours. Look at Hebrews chapter 11, verse 32. You might want to make a note back to the book of Judges, 14 through 16, and vice versa. But Hebrews 11:32 says this. You know that chapter, right? It's Faith Hall of Fame, some of the most faithful men and women in the Bible. But then really the point is not them. I wish chapter 12, the first few verses, had been left in chapter 11, because the point is, look at all these great people. You're surrounded by a cloud of witnesses, but they're all saying the same thing. Look to Jesus, the author and finisher of our faith. It's not about David. It's not about all the different people in Hebrews chapter 11, but it's about Jesus. That's what they would all say, and that's what we need to remember and keep our eyes on. But verse 32 kind of ends it. And what more shall I say? For time would fail me to tell of Gideon, Barak, Samson, Jephthah, of David, Samuel, and the prophets. So when I think about the life of Samson, was he a man that went to heaven? Did he even do a very good job as a judge? There are a lot of questions, but the fact that he's mentioned in Hebrews chapter 11 gives me hope that maybe we can meet him in heaven one day. And the same could be said maybe of others in this passage as well. Why do we believe in Samson? Well, we believe in Samson for all the things Neil said and for others because we believe the Bible. There's no reason, no evidence to believe anything other than that. Samson is mentioned in both the Old Testament and the New. And this is the last thing that I want to leave you with. Look at these 2 verses, if you don't mind, as a way of an invitation. And this will kind of change direction slightly, but Samson would also fit really well into these verses. But look at Revelation chapter 2 and verse 20. And then if you want to mark, because that'll be pretty quick, mark John 18:17. But I want you to link these 2 verses together if you take notes in your Bible. John chapter 18 and verse 17. And then Revelation chapter 2 and verse 20. We're thinking about the life of Samson. How could he do so much good? And how could he do so much bad? How could both fit into one life? Revelation 2:20 says, talking about a list of all these good things that the church had done in Thyatira. But verse 20 says, notwithstanding, or however, I have a few things against you. God has given, or Jesus in this verse has given a list of great things the church in Thyatira has done, but he said, but, even though you've done all those great things, I have something against you. You've still messed up. You've still got something that we've got to address. John chapter 18 and verse 17 says, then saith the damsel that kept the door unto Peter. Now this is the last week of Jesus' earthly life before the crucifixion. They've taken him. He's about to be put on a trial, and Peter has just said, I'll die for you. And he proved it by pulling out a sword and probably trying to kill a guy but cutting his ear off. And now here he is amongst the enemy, not with Jesus, not with all of his brethren. And how is he going to act? How is he going to behave? Is he going to live up to that? Will he die for Jesus? Will he be the only one that doesn't leave? Verse 17, then says the damsel that kept the door unto Peter, Aren't you also the one that was with this man, one of his disciples? And what did Peter say? I am not. The point I want to make is this. People's lives may be filled with a lot of good. People's lives may be filled with a lot of bad. But even people who are evil and sinful can be used by God for His purposes. But even more importantly for us who are here for a Bible study, call ourselves Christians and are Christians, this is important to know that good people can commit sins. Even people that are very devoted to God. And that's an important lesson for each of us to have. We usually offer an invitation, and it gives people two chances. One, if you're not a Christian, to become one. We haven't really talked about that tonight, but I do think we've given you enough evidence to believe in the power of God, to see how life will look with God on your side and listening to what He says versus relying on your own strength and your own power and living according to the way you want to. But it's also an opportunity for those of us that are Christians to ask for help if we need it. You know what our society says is, you are strong enough. You're enough by yourself, and you should be able to do everything by yourself. If you show any kind of weakness, it's wrong. You shouldn't do it. It makes you look weak. But the interesting thing about the Bible is it usually does things different than the world does it. And God's message to us would be, if you can't do everything on your own, good. You weren't designed to. You know, I could show you a list of everyone in the Bible that did it on their own. And I can email you a copy of this. But this is what the list looks like. There's no one on it. Think about even Jesus, our perfect example. Jesus didn't come to this earth and live in and of Himself, but He had parents, earthly parents, that helped Him and taught Him. He grew, Luke chapter 2 says He grew not only in stature, but in wisdom and in favor with God and man. If Jesus had some areas in which He had to grow in His humanity, then you and I will too. But not only that, but He surrounded Himself with the disciples, and then even a smaller group, the 12 apostles, and then even the inner 3. Jesus knew that He needed support and He needed help. And that same exact scenario plays out through every successful Bible character that we read about. Now, I believe in Sampson, not because there's a lot of historical evidence, not because there's a lot of archaeological evidence, because there's not, but because the Bible says he's real and because he's so flawed. God uses flawed people. He did then, and I'm thankful to God that He still does now. And even in my flaws and in my weaknesses, I can celebrate that because God is made perfect in my weaknesses. And I've got no problem saying I've sinned. I've got no problem saying I messed up. I've got no problem saying I need help. Because I just understand that the reality of it is that's where we all are. And outside of God, we're lost. And outside of each other, we're in for a lot of trouble. So if you're here tonight and you're not a Christian, you can become one. We can study with you more and tell you more about the life of Jesus and why you should believe in that. We can baptize you and we can help give you the tools to live a life faithful to God. Or if you're here and you're a Christian and you're going through something awful, if you've got a sin that's gripped you over and over and over and you can't shake it free, part of the reason that you're going through that is you haven't used all the tools God has given you. It's not enough just to say, well, I'm going to do better, although God expects that. It's not enough just to say, I'm going to pray to God, though God expects that. But we need each other. So if you need to ask for help from the church in a big public way in front of everyone, this is a good chance to do that. And if not, and you want to talk to someone privately and quietly later, reach out to someone and do that. Because we all need each other, and God uses us even if we're flawed. So if you want to become a Christian or we can help you with anything, come forward, let us know while we stand and sing this song.